Richard Miller hurled another suitcase onto the rain-soaked driveway, his face, usually calm and collected, twisted with rage. "Get out!" he roared, his voice barely audible over the howling wind. "I'm done with you, Jennifer." Jennifer Miller, her designer dress now soaked and clinging to her slim frame, stared at her husband in disbelief. Just hours ago, they had been planning their 15th anniversary celebration. Now her world was crumbling around her. "Richard, please," she begged, her voice breaking. "What's going on? Talk to me." But Richard was beyond reason. He stormed back into the house, emerging moments later with an armful of Jennifer's clothes. He threw them onto the growing pile on the driveway. 15 years, Jennifer," he shouted. 15 years of trying and nothing. You can't give me the one thing I need, an heir to my empire." Jennifer flinched as if she'd been slapped. They had been trying to conceive for years, enduring countless treatments and heartbreaks. Each failure had been a knife in her heart, but she'd always believed Richard understood. As Richard continued his tirade, Jennifer's mind flashed back to happier times. Their wedding day, Richard's eyes full of love as he promised to stand by her side forever. Their first anniversary spent on a secluded beach, dreaming of the family they would build together. The day Richard's first real estate deal went through, and how they danced in their tiny apartment, full of hope for the future. Those memories now seemed like scenes from someone else's life. "Richard, stop," Jennifer cried, reaching for him. "We can work this out. We always have." Richard jerked away from her touch. "There's nothing to work out. It's over, Jennifer." Just then, the crunch of tires on gravel cut through the storm. A sleek sports car pulled up, and out stepped Grace, Richard's young assistant. Jennifer's heart sank as she saw the triumphant gleam in the other woman's eye. "Richard, baby," Grace called out, her voice sickly sweet. "Is everything okay? I got worried when you didn't show up for our dinner." Jennifer's world tilted on its axis. "Dinner?" she whispered, looking between Richard and Grace. "What's going on?" Richard's face hardened. "Grace is pregnant, Jennifer. She's giving me what you never could." The words hit Jennifer like a physical blow. She staggered back, her mind reeling. "You and her, how long?" "Long enough," Richard sneered. "Now get out. You're no longer welcome in this house." Grace sidled up, wrapping herself around Richard. Her hand rested possessively on her still flat stomach. "Don't worry, Jennifer," she smirked. "I'll take good care of him and our baby." Jennifer felt something inside her shatter. The love she'd believed in, the life she'd built, it had all been a lie. With shaking hands, she gathered what she could of her rain-soaked belongings. "You will regret this, Richard," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "Someday you'll realize what you've thrown away." Richard Miller's only response was to turn his back, leading Grace into the warmth of the house, the home that had been Jennifer's just moments ago. Left alone in the storm, Jennifer looked at the mansion she'd called home for the past decade. The windows glowed with warm light, a stark contrast to the cold, wet darkness surrounding her. For a moment, she was tempted to beg, to plead for another chance. But a new feeling was rising within her, a mix of anger, determination, and something else she couldn't quite name. With a deep breath, Jennifer turned away from her old life. She had no idea where she would go or what she would do, but she knew she couldn't stay here, clinging to the shattered remains of her marriage. As she walked away, her designer heels sinking into the muddy driveway, Jennifer placed a hand on her stomach. A wave of nausea washed over her, from stress or something else, she wasn't sure. But in that moment, a tiny spark of hope flickered to life. Whatever happened next, Jennifer knew one thing for certain: her life would never be the same. Richard Miller sat in his plush office, staring at the city skyline, his empire stretched before him. But his mind was elsewhere, lost in memories of a past he tried so hard to forget. He was 8 again, sitting in the back seat of his parents' car. They were laughing, discussing plans for his upcoming birthday. Then, screeching tires, a blinding light, silence. Richard blinked, forcing himself back to the present. That night had changed everything. One moment, he was a happy kid with loving parents. The next, he was alone, thrust into the cold world of St. Michael's Orphanage. Life at the orphanage was tough. Richard quickly learned that vulnerability was a weakness others would exploit. He built walls around his heart, vowing never to let anyone close enough to hurt him again. As he grew older, Richard's determination hardened. He excelled in school, earning a scholarship to a prestigious university. There, he discovered his talent for real estate and his hunger for success. Fresh out of college, Richard landed an entry-level job at a small real estate firm. He worked tirelessly, often sleeping at his desk. His ambition caught the eye of the firm's owner, who became a mentor of sorts. It was during this time that Richard made his first ethically questionable decision. A family was struggling to make payments on their home. Instead of working with them, Richard saw an opportunity. He convinced his boss to foreclose quickly, then flipped the property for a significant profit. The guilt gnawed at him, but the thrill of success was intoxicating. Richard pushed the family's faces from his mind, focusing instead on his rising bank balance. As Richard climbed the corporate ladder, he met Daniel Hall, a young lawyer with a sharp mind and an unwavering moral compass. Despite their differences, the two became friends. Daniel was often the voice of reason, trying to temper Richard's more ruthless impulses. "Richard, we can't go through with this deal," Daniel argued one day, waving a stack of papers. "These people will lose everything." Richard's jaw clenched. "It's just business, Daniel. If we don't do it, someone else will." Daniel shook his head. "That doesn't make it right." But Richard was already walking away, deaf to his friend's protests. He had an empire to build, and he wouldn't let anyone or anything stand in his way. Years passed, and Richard's success grew. He started his own company, Miller Developments, and quickly made a name for himself in the cutthroat world of New York real estate. His methods weren't always ethical, but they were effective. Richard had a knack for finding loopholes, pressuring the right people, and making problems disappear. With each success, the walls around his heart grew higher. On the surface, Richard had it all: money, power, respect. But in quiet moments, when the city slept and he was alone with his thoughts, he felt the emptiness gnawing at him. It was during one of these moments that he met Jennifer. She was different from the women he usually encountered in his world. Kind, genuine, with a warmth that seemed to melt his carefully constructed defenses. For a while, Richard allowed himself to hope. Maybe with Jennifer, he could have the family he'd lost all those years ago. Maybe he could finally fill the void inside him. But as the years passed and Jennifer failed to give him a child, old fears resurfaced. The idea of that deeper connection, of being truly vulnerable, terrified him. It was easier to retreat behind his walls, to focus on his empire. Now, sitting in his office, Richard looked at the photo on his desk. It was from his wedding day, he and Jennifer smiling at the camera. He remembered the hope he'd felt that day, the promise of a different kind of life. With a swift motion, he knocked the frame face down. He'd made his choice. His empire was all that mattered now. He'd worked too hard, sacrificed too much to let anything or anyone threaten it. As he turned back to the window, Richard made a silent vow. He would never allow himself to be vulnerable again, no matter the cost. The intercom buzzed, interrupting his thoughts. "Mr. Miller, your two is here." Richard straightened his tie, his face settling into its usual mask of confident indifference. It was time to get back to business. After all, empires don't build themselves. Richard Miller leaned back in his chair, swirling a glass of expensive whiskey. Across from him, Grace lounged on the couch, her hand resting on her barely visible baby bump. "We should start looking at schools," Grace said, scrolling through her phone. "Only the best for our little heir." Richard nodded, a smug smile playing on his lips. "Of course. Nothing but the finest for my child." As they discussed their lavish plans for the future, Richard felt a surge of satisfaction. This was what he'd always wanted: an heir to his empire, someone to carry on his legacy. With Grace, everything seemed to be falling into place. "We should celebrate," Richard declared, standing up. "How about dinner at LeBlanc tonight?" Grace's eyes lit up. "Perfect. I'll wear that new dress you bought me." As Richard and Grace rode in their luxury car across the city, Jennifer Miller was facing a very different reality. The harsh fluorescent lights of the women's shelter flickered as Jennifer stared at the ceiling, unable to sleep. The thin mattress did little to cushion her from the hard floor, and the snores and quiet sobs of the other women filled the air. How had she ended up here? Just days ago, she'd been living in a mansion, planning charity galas. Now, she was homeless, penniless, and alone. Jennifer's hand drifted to her stomach, a habit she'd developed over the past few days. Something felt different, but she couldn't quite put her finger on it. The next morning, after a meager breakfast at the shelter, Jennifer made her way to a free clinic. Her suspicions were confirmed. She was pregnant. As the doctor explained her options, Jennifer's mind raced. Should she tell Richard? Would he take her back, or would he accuse her of trying to trap him? After a sleepless night weighing her options, Jennifer made a decision. She wouldn't tell Richard. This baby was hers, and she would find a way to provide for it on her own. With renewed determination, Jennifer hit the streets, looking for work. But with no recent job experience and unwilling to use Richard's name as a reference, she faced rejection after rejection. "I'm sorry," one manager said, not unkindly, "but we need someone with more experience." Jennifer nodded, fighting back tears. As she left the building, she overheard two women talking. "Did you hear LeBlanc is hiring servers? The pay's not great, but the tips are good." Hope flared in Jennifer's chest. It wasn't much, but it was a start. Meanwhile, Richard was throwing himself into his work with renewed vigor. He stormed through the office, barking orders and making demands. "I want that deal closed by Friday," he snapped at a trembling intern. "No excuses." Daniel watched from his office, a frown creasing his forehead. "You're pushing them too hard, Richard," he warned. Richard scoffed. "This is business, Daniel. If they can't handle it, they don't belong here." As the days passed, Richard's arrogance grew. He was untouchable, unstoppable. Nothing could stand in his way. Jennifer, on the other hand, was learning humility. After a grueling interview process, she landed the job at LeBlanc. The work was hard, the hours long, but Jennifer threw herself into it with everything she had. "You're doing great, Jennifer," the head chef told her after a particularly busy shift. "Keep it up." Jennifer smiled, feeling a small spark of pride. She could do this. She would do this for herself and her baby. Weeks passed, and Jennifer's morning sickness was brutal, but she pushed through, determined to keep her job. She was just starting to feel like she might be able to handle this new life when everything changed again. It was a busy Saturday night at LeBlanc. Jennifer was rushing between tables when she heard a familiar laugh. Her heart stopped. There, at a corner table, sat Richard and Grace. They were laughing, clinking champagne glasses, looking like the perfect couple. Jennifer froze, her tray wobbling dangerously. The room started to spin. She couldn't breathe. "Jennifer?" Sarah's voice seemed to come from far away. "Are you okay?" Jennifer managed a small shake of her head before her knees buckled. Sarah caught her just before she hit the ground. "Let's get you to the back," Sarah said, leading her away from the dining room. As they passed Richard's table, Jennifer held her breath, but Richard and Grace were too engrossed in each other to notice the commotion. In the kitchen, Jennifer sank onto a chair, her hands shaking. "I'm sorry," she whispered. Sarah patted her shoulder. "Don't worry about it. Are you feeling sick? The flu's been going around." Jennifer nodded, grateful for the excuse. As she sat there, trying to calm her racing heart, a strange feeling washed over her. Seeing Richard with Grace had hurt, yes, but it had also ignited something inside her, a fierce determination. She would survive this, she would thrive, and she would do it all without Richard Miller. Across town, Richard paced in his office, phone pressed to his ear. "Listen, Daniel, I need those environmental reports changed. Make the contamination levels look lower." "But Mr. Miller," the voice on the other end protested, "that's illegal. If we're caught." "We won't be caught," Richard snapped. "Just do it. This deal is worth millions." He hung up, a triumphant smile spreading across his face. The Riverside Development Project was his ticket to the big leagues. A few tweaked numbers were a small price to pay. Across town, Jennifer struggled through another shift at LeBlanc. Her growing belly made maneuvering between tables increasingly difficult. "Watch it," a customer snapped as Jennifer narrowly avoided spilling water on him. "I'm so sorry," Jennifer mumbled, her cheeks burning with embarrassment. In the kitchen, she overheard two coworkers whispering, "How much longer is Sarah going to keep her on? She can barely carry a tray." Jennifer's hands shook as she loaded her next order. She needed this job. She couldn't lose it now. Back at Miller Developments, Richard was in high spirits. The Riverside deal was almost closed. He strode into the conference room where potential investors waited. "Gentlemen," he announced, I have great news. The environmental reports came back clean. Riverside is ready for development. As Richard laid out his plans, painting pictures of luxury condos and high-end retail spaces, Daniel watched from the corner, his brow furrowed. After the meeting, Daniel cornered Richard in his office. "Richard, we need to talk about Riverside," Daniel said quietly. Richard's smile faded. "What about it?" "I've seen the original reports," Daniel replied. "I know what you did." Richard's jaw clenched. "It's just business, Daniel. No one's getting hurt." "No one's getting hurt." Daniel's voice rose. "What about the families who will be living on contaminated land? What about the workers who will be exposed to those chemicals?" "You're overreacting," Richard scoffed. "The levels are barely above the legal limits." "That doesn't make it right." Daniel slammed his hand on the desk. "Richard, this isn't you. What happened to the guy who wanted to make a difference?" Richard's eyes hardened. "That guy grew up. This is the real world, Daniel. If you can't handle it, maybe you don't belong here." The two men glared at each other, years of friendship straining under the weight of Richard's ambition. Meanwhile, Jennifer faced her own battle at LeBlanc. As she struggled to carry a heavy tray, she overheard the manager talking to Sarah. "We can't keep her on much longer, Sarah," he said. "She's becoming a liability." Jennifer's heart sank, but then a strange calm washed over her. She'd faced worse. She could handle this. Squaring her shoulders, Jennifer approached them. "Excuse me," she said, her voice steadier than she felt. "I couldn't help overhearing. I understand your concerns, but I assure you I can do this job." The manager looked skeptical. "Miss Miller, we appreciate your effort, but give me 2 weeks," Jennifer interrupted. "If I can't keep up, I'll resign. No severance needed." Sarah and the manager exchanged glances. Finally, Sarah nodded. 2 weeks. As Jennifer walked away, she felt a newfound strength coursing through her. She'd fought for herself, something she'd never done before. That evening, as Richard celebrated the Riverside deal with Grace, his phone buzzed. It was Daniel. "Richard, I can't be part of this anymore. I'm resigning." Richard stared at the phone, a mix of anger and something like regret washing over him, but he pushed it down. He'd come too far to start having doubts now. "Your loss," he muttered, tossing the phone aside. Grace watched him curiously. "Everything okay, baby?" Richard forced a smile. "Just fine. Daniel is leaving the company, that's all." Grace's eyes lit up. "Does that mean I can take his office? It has a much better view than mine." Richard nodded absently, his mind already moving on to the next deal, the next conquest. Later that night, as Richard slept, Grace crept into his home office. She'd noticed him acting strange lately, always locking drawers, password-protecting files. Her eyes landed on a folder labeled Riverside Confidential. Glancing over her shoulder, she opened it. As she read, her eyes widened. This was big. This could change everything. A slow smile spread across Grace's face. Richard Miller's empire of sand was about to crashing down, and she'd be there to pick up the pieces. Grace sauntered into Richard's office, a cold smile on her face. "Richard, darling, we need to talk about my new position in the company," Grace said smoothly. Richard looked up from his computer, confusion etched on his face. "New position? What are you talking about?" Grace's smile turned predatory. "Well, with Daniel gone, I think it's time I took on more responsibility. After all, I am carrying your heir." Richard's eyes narrowed. "Grace, you're not qualified for Daniel's job." "Oh, I think you'll find I'm qualified for a lot of things," Grace purred, sliding a folder across his desk. "Especially when I know so much about Riverside." Richard's face paled as he opened the folder. Inside were copies of the original environmental reports. "Where did you get these?" he demanded. Grace shrugged. "Does it matter? What matters is what I could do with them." As the implication sank in, Richard felt a cold sweat break out on his forehead. Grace had him cornered. Meanwhile, at LeBlanc, Jennifer was in the middle of another grueling shift. As she rushed to deliver an order, a wave of nausea hit her. She stumbled, nearly dropping her tray, when strong hands steadied her. "Whoa there, careful." Sarah's voice came from behind her. Jennifer turned, embarrassment coloring her cheeks. "I'm so sorry, Sarah. I don't know what came over me." Sarah's eyes narrowed, taking in Jennifer's pale face and the way her hand unconsciously rested on her stomach. "Come with me," she said, leading Jennifer to the break room. Once inside, Sarah crossed her arms. "How far along are you?" Jennifer's eyes widened. What?" "The pregnancy," Sarah said softly. "How far along?" Tears welled up in Jennifer's eyes. "About 3 months," she whispered. To Jennifer's surprise, Sarah's face softened. "Does the father know?" Jennifer shook her head, the words tumbling out before she could stop them. She told Sarah everything, about Richard being kicked out and her determination to make it on her own. When she finished, Sarah was quiet for a long moment. Then she did something that shocked Jennifer. She hugged her. "Listen to me," Sarah said fiercely. "You're not alone in this. I've got your back." Jennifer pulled back, stunned. "But why?" Sarah's eyes grew distant. "Because 15 years ago, I was you." As Sarah shared her own story of being abandoned while pregnant, Jennifer felt a connection forming between them. For the first time since that rainy night, she didn't feel alone. Across town, Richard was grappling with his own problems. Grace's subtle threats were becoming more frequent, her demands more outrageous. "I think I should sit in on the board meeting tomorrow," Grace announced one evening. Richard's patience snapped. "Enough, Grace. You're not qualified for this. Your job is to be my assistant and the mother of my child, nothing more." Grace's eyes flashed dangerously. "Careful, Richard. You wouldn't want certain documents finding their way to the wrong hands, would you?" As Grace stormed out, Richard slumped in his chair. How had he let things get so out of control? The next evening, Richard decided to clear his head with dinner at LeBlanc. As he walked in, he failed to notice Jennifer ducking behind the bar, her heart pounding. "Table for one," he told the hostess. As Richard was led to his table, Jennifer peeked around the corner. Her breath caught in her throat as she watched him sit down, looking tired and stressed. For a moment, she felt a pang of sympathy, then remembered the night he had thrown her out, and her resolve hardened. Sarah appeared at her side. "You okay?" Jennifer nodded, straightening up. "I am. He doesn't control my life anymore." Sarah squeezed her shoulder. "That's my girl. Now let's get through this shift. I've got a killer chocolate cake recipe to teach you after." As Jennifer moved through the restaurant, carefully avoiding Richard's table, she felt a newfound confidence. She was stronger than she'd ever been, and she wasn't alone. Richard, oblivious to Jennifer's presence, stared at his menu without really seeing it. His empire was built on sand, and Grace held the power to make it all crumble. He needed a plan, and fast. As the evening wore on, Richard and Jennifer's paths nearly crossed several times. Each near miss sent Jennifer's heart racing, but she managed to stay out of sight. Finally, Richard left, none the wiser to her presence. As the door closed behind him, Jennifer let out a breath she didn't realize she'd been holding. Sarah appeared at her side, a knowing look in her eyes. "You did good, kid. Now, about that chocolate cake." As Jennifer followed Sarah to the kitchen, she felt a glimmer of hope. Maybe, just maybe, she could build a new life for herself and her baby, a life free from Richard Miller's shadow. The next night, Richard straightened his tie as he entered LeBlanc. This dinner meeting could make or break his latest deal. He needed to be on top of his game. "Mr. Miller, your guests are already seated," the hostess said, leading him to a corner table. As Richard approached, his eyes scanned the room, taking in the elegant decor and the bustling waitstaff. Suddenly, he froze. There, across the room, was a familiar face, Jennifer. For a moment, he thought he was seeing things, but no, it was definitely her. His ex-wife was weaving between tables, carrying a tray of drinks, and she was unmistakably pregnant. Richard's mind reeled. Jennifer was here, working as a waitress, and pregnant. How was this possible? "Mr. Miller?" One of his dinner guests stood, extending a hand. "Is everything all right?" Richard snapped back to reality, forcing a smile. "Yes, of course. Shall we begin?" As the meeting progressed, Richard found it increasingly difficult to concentrate. His eyes kept drifting to Jennifer, watching as she efficiently moved through the restaurant. Jennifer, for her part, had noticed Richard the moment he walked in. Her heart had nearly stopped, but she forced herself to keep working. She wouldn't let him see how much his presence affected her. As the evening wore on, Richard's distraction became more apparent. He fumbled through explanations, lost track of questions, and twice nearly knocked over his water glass. "Mr. Miller, perhaps we should reschedule," one of the investors suggested, concern evident in his voice. Richard opened his mouth to respond when a new voice cut in. "Richard, darling, what a surprise!" Grace sauntered up to the table, her pregnancy now clearly visible. She placed a possessive hand on Richard's shoulder. "I was just meeting some friends for dinner and saw you here." Richard stiffened under her touch. "Grace, this isn't a good time. I'm in a meeting." Grace's eyes narrowed slightly, but her smile remained fixed. "Oh, I'm so sorry. I didn't mean to interrupt." As Grace chatted with the investors, Richard's gaze drifted back to Jennifer. To his shock, she was approaching their table. "Good evening," Jennifer said, her voice steady. "Can I get you anything else?" For a moment, the table fell silent. Richard stared at Jennifer, a mix of emotions playing across his face: shock, guilt, and perhaps regret. Grace recovered first. Well, if it isn't the ex-Mrs. Miller waiting tables now, are we?" "How quaint," Grace sneered. Jennifer's chin lifted slightly. "I prefer to think of it as honest work, Mrs. Miller. Now, can I get you anything, or are you just here to cause a scene?" Grace's face flushed with anger, but before she could respond, one of the investors spoke up. "I'll have another scotch, please." Jennifer nodded, ignoring Richard's attempt to catch her eye. "Right away, sir." As Jennifer walked away, Richard felt a strange mix of emotions: pride at her composure, shame at his own actions, and a growing unease about the choices he'd made. The rest of the dinner passed in a blur. The investors left, clearly unimpressed with Richard's distracted performance. Grace stormed out after a heated, whispered argument. Finally, Richard found himself alone at the table, watching as Jennifer continued her shift. As the restaurant began to empty, Richard approached Jennifer at the bar. "Jennifer, can we talk?" he asked. Jennifer turned, her face impassive. "I'm working, Richard. Some of us have to earn a living." "Please," Richard said, his voice low. "Just 5 minutes." Jennifer sighed. "My shift ends in 10 minutes. I'll meet you outside." Those 10 minutes felt like an eternity to Richard. When Jennifer finally emerged, he barely recognized her. Gone was the polished socialite. In her place stood a woman who radiated quiet strength. "Why didn't you tell me?" Richard blurted out, gesturing to her stomach. Jennifer's hand instinctively went to her belly. "Would it have made a difference?" Richard opened his mouth, then closed it. He didn't have an answer. "That's what I thought," Jennifer said quietly. "Goodbye, Richard." As Jennifer walked away, Richard felt as if his carefully constructed world was crumbling around him. Unbeknownst to either of them, Grace watched from her car across the street, her face contorted with rage as she saw Richard watching Jennifer leave. "You'll regret this, Richard Miller," she hissed, pulling out her phone. "If I'm going down, I'm taking you with me." As Grace dialed a number, her finger hovered over a folder labeled Riverside Evidence. Richard stood alone on the sidewalk, the weight of his choices finally catching up to him. Richard's phone wouldn't stop ringing as he rushed into his office. His assistant intercepted him, her face pale. "Mr. Miller, there's a reporter from the New York Times on line 1. They're asking about Riverside." Richard felt the blood drain from his face. He snatched the phone. Miller speaking. "Mr. Miller, we've received some interesting documents about the Riverside project. Care to comment on the altered environmental reports?" Richard's mind raced. How had they found out? Then it hit him. Grace. "No comment," he growled, slamming down the phone. Over the next few hours, Richard's world unraveled. More reporters called, investors demanded explanations, and the board of directors called an emergency meeting. Richard paced his office, barking orders into his phone. "I don't care what it costs. Shut this down now." But it was too late. By afternoon, the story had broken. Miller Developments accused of environmental cover-up, the headlines screamed. Richard's phone buzzed with a text from Grace. "Should have treated me better. This is just the beginning." As Richard fought to contain the damage, across town, Jennifer faced her own crisis. She was in the middle of a shift at LeBlanc when a sharp pain hit her abdomen. She gasped, dropping the tray she was carrying. Sarah was at her side in an instant. "Jennifer, what's wrong?" "The baby," Jennifer whispered, her face contorted in pain. "Something's wrong with the baby." Sarah didn't hesitate. "I'm calling an ambulance." At the hospital, doctors rushed Jennifer into emergency care, while Sarah paced the waiting room, feeling helpless. Meanwhile, Richard was in the middle of a heated board meeting when his phone buzzed again. He glanced at it, ready to ignore another reporter, but the name made him pause. It was from LeBlanc. "Mr. Miller, this is Sarah from LeBlanc. Jennifer has been taken to Metro General. There are complications with her pregnancy." Richard felt the world tilt. Jennifer, the baby, his baby. "I have to go," he muttered, standing abruptly. "Richard, we're not finished here," one of the board members protested, but Richard was already out the door. As he sped to the hospital, Richard's mind was in chaos. His carefully constructed world was crumbling. The empire he'd sacrificed everything for was teetering on the brink of collapse, and now Jennifer and their child were in danger. For the first time in years, Richard felt the full weight of his choices. The lies, the manipulations, the people he'd stepped on to get to the top. What had it all been for? At the hospital, Richard burst through the emergency room doors. "Jennifer Miller," he gasped to the receptionist. "Where is she?" "Are you family?" the nurse asked, eyeing him suspiciously. Richard hesitated. What was he to Jennifer now? I'm the baby's father." The nurse pointed him to a waiting area where he found Sarah, who looked surprised to see him. "How is she?" Richard demanded. Sarah's eyes narrowed. "Why do you care? You threw her out, remember?" Richard flinched at the accusation. "Please," he said softly, "I need to know." Sarah sighed. "They're still running tests. It might be preeclampsia. It's serious." Richard sank into a chair, his head in his hands. How had everything gone so wrong? Hours passed. Richard's phone buzzed constantly, but he ignored it. Nothing mattered except the news about Jennifer and the baby. Finally, a doctor approached. "Mr. Miller?" Richard stood, his heart pounding. "Yes, how are they?" "We've stabilized Jennifer's condition," the doctor said, "but she'll need to remain hospitalized for the rest of her pregnancy. The next few weeks are critical." Richard nodded, relief washing over him. "Can I see her?" The doctor hesitated. "She's asking for Sarah." Richard felt a pang of hurt but nodded. He had no right to expect anything from Jennifer. As Sarah disappeared into Jennifer's room, Richard slumped back in his chair. His phone buzzed again, a text from his assistant. "Board voting to suspend you pending investigation. Please respond ASAP." Richard stared at the message, feeling oddly detached. Just days ago, this would have sent him into a panic. Now it seemed trivial compared to what was happening in that hospital room. For the first time in years, Richard faced the emptiness of the life he'd built. His empire was crumbling, and he might lose the only things that truly mattered, Jennifer and their child. As he sat in that sterile waiting room, Richard made a silent vow. If given the chance, he would make things right. Not for his empire, but for his family. Later, Richard sat in his office, staring at the clock. In 30 minutes, he had a crucial board meeting that could determine the fate of his company. His phone buzzed incessantly with messages from lawyers, PR teams, and panicked executives, but his mind was elsewhere, at the hospital with Jennifer. A knock on the door jolted him from his thoughts. His assistant poked her head in. "Mr. Miller, the board is gathering. They're expecting you in the conference room." Richard nodded absently. He stood, straightening his tie, when his phone buzzed again. It was Sarah. "Jennifer is asking for you." Without a second thought, Richard grabbed his coat. "Cancel the meeting," he told his shocked assistant as he rushed past her. As he sped to the hospital, Richard's phone exploded with calls and messages, but he ignored them all. At the hospital, Richard found Sarah outside Jennifer's room. "She's having a rough day," Sarah warned. "Be gentle." Richard entered the room quietly. Jennifer lay in the bed, looking pale and tired. When she saw him, her eyes widened in surprise. "Richard, what are you doing here?" "You asked for me," he said softly. Jennifer shook her head. "I asked Sarah to keep you updated. I didn't expect you to come." An awkward silence fell between them. Richard stepped closer to the bed. "Jennifer, I'm so sorry for everything." Jennifer's eyes filled with tears. "Do you have any idea what you put me through?" "I lost everything, Richard. My home, my security, my dignity." "I know," Richard said, his voice thick with emotion. "I was wrong, so wrong. I let greed and ambition blind me to what really mattered." Jennifer steadied his face. "And what matters now?" "You," he said without hesitation. "You and our baby. Nothing else." Jennifer's hand instinctively went to her stomach. "It's not that simple, Richard. You can't just walk back in and expect everything to be okay." "I know," Richard nodded. "I don't expect forgiveness. I just want a chance to make things right, to be there for you and our child." As they talked, Richard's phone buzzed continuously. He ignored it. "Aren't you going to get that?" Jennifer asked. Richard shook his head. "Nothing is more important than this conversation." For the first time, Jennifer saw a glimmer of the man she had fallen in love with years ago, but she was hesitant to trust again. "Richard, I appreciate you being here, but I need time. This is all too much, too fast." Richard noted her understanding. "I'll be here, Jennifer. Whatever you need." As they talked, neither was aware of the storm brewing outside. Across town, Grace sat in a cafe, a satisfied smirk on her face as she hit send on an email. Attached were all the documents she had gathered on Richard's shady deals over the years. Within hours, the story exploded. Every major news outlet was running exposés on Caldwell Development's illegal practices. Richard's empire was crumbling in real time, and he was oblivious to it all, sitting by Jennifer's bedside. It wasn't until Daniel burst into the hospital room that reality came crashing down. "Richard," Daniel panted, out of breath. "We have a problem, a big one." Richard looked up, startled. "Daniel, what are you doing here?" Daniel's face was grim. "Grace leaked everything, Richard. All the files, all the evidence, it's all over the news." Richard felt the blood drain from his face. He glanced at Jennifer, who was watching the exchange with wide eyes. "How bad is it?" Richard asked quietly. Daniel shook his head. "It's bad, Richard. The SEC is involved. There's talk of criminal charges." Richard sank into a chair, his head in his hands. "Everything I built, everything I sacrificed for is gone." "Richard," Jennifer's voice was soft. "What's going on?" Richard looked up at her, his eyes filled with a mixture of fear and resolve. "My company is falling apart, Jennifer. Everything I've worked for. It's over." "What are you going to do?" she asked. Richard was quiet for a moment. Then he reached out and took Jennifer's hand. "I'm going to stay right here, if you'll let me." Jennifer's eyes widened in surprise. "But your company," Richard finished. "It's just a company. I've lost sight of what's truly important for too long. I won't make that mistake again." As Richard sat there holding Jennifer's hand, he felt a strange sense of peace. His empire was in ruins, his reputation destroyed, but for the first time in years, he felt like he was exactly where he needed to be. Daniel watched the scene unfold, a mix of emotions on his face. "Richard, the board is demanding an emergency meeting. They're voting to remove you as CEO." Richard nodded, not taking his eyes off Jennifer. "Tell them I resign, effective immediately." As Daniel left to deliver the message, Richard turned back to Jennifer. "I know I have a lot to make up for," Richard said. "But if you'll give me a chance, I want to be here for you, for our baby, for our family." Jennifer, torn between caution and hope, squeezed Richard's hand. "One day at a time, Richard. One day at a time." The following weeks were a whirlwind for Richard Miller. His empire crumbled around him as investigations into Caldwell Development intensified. Assets were frozen, partnerships dissolved, and his once stellar reputation lay in tatters. Grace disappeared as quickly as she had entered his life, leaving behind a trail of destruction and a note that simply read, "You should have treated me better." Despite the chaos, Richard remained by Jennifer's side at the hospital. He slept in an uncomfortable chair, ate from vending machines, and fielded calls from lawyers in hushed tones in the hallway. Jennifer watched this transformation with a mixture of caution and growing respect. The arrogant, ruthless businessman was gone, replaced by a man who seemed genuinely committed to making amends. One morning, as Richard returned from a coffee run, he found Jennifer's room in a flurry of activity. Nurses rushed around, and Jennifer's face was contorted in pain. "What's happening?" Richard asked, his heart racing. A nurse turned to him. "She's gone into labor. It's too early. We're preparing for an emergency C-section." Richard felt the world tilt. This was too soon. The baby wasn't due for another month. As they wheeled Jennifer toward the operating room, she reached out and grabbed Richard's hand. "Don't leave me," she whispered, fear evident in her eyes. "Never again," Richard promised, squeezing her hand. In the operating room, Richard stood by Jennifer's side, trying to offer comfort as the doctors worked. The beeping of machines and the urgent voices of medical staff filled the air. As the situation intensified, Richard felt a wave of memory wash over him. Suddenly, he was 8 years old again, sitting in the back of his parents' car, the screeching of tires, the sound of breaking glass, the terrifying silence that followed. Richard shook his head, forcing himself back to the present. He couldn't fall apart now. Jennifer needed him. "Stay with me, Jennifer," he urged, his voice thick with emotion. "You're the strongest person I know. You can do this." Jennifer's grip on his hand tightened as another contraction hit. "I'm scared," she admitted. "I know," he said softly, "but I'm right here. We're in this together." As the doctors worked, Richard felt a surge of protectiveness he had never experienced before. This was his family. He'd already failed them once. He wouldn't do it again. Finally, after what seemed like hours, a tiny cry filled the room. Richard's heart leapt. "It's a boy," the doctor announced, holding up a small, wrinkled bundle. But the joy was short-lived. The baby's cries were weak, and he was quickly whisked away to a waiting incubator. "What's wrong?" Jennifer asked, panicking. "Why isn't he with me?" The doctor's face was grim. "He's having trouble breathing. We need to get him to the NICU immediately." As they rushed the baby out, Richard felt torn. He wanted to follow his son, but he couldn't leave Jennifer. "Go, Richard," she said, sensing his dilemma. "Go with our baby. Make sure he's okay." Richard nodded, pressing a quick kiss to Jennifer's forehead before following the medical team to the NICU. Richard watched helplessly as doctors and nurses worked on his tiny son. The baby looked so fragile, hooked up to machines that dwarfed his small body. As he stood there, Richard felt something break inside him. All the walls he'd built and all the emotional distance he'd maintained over the years crumbled in the face of this tiny fighting life. Tears streamed down his face as he placed a hand on the incubator. "Hey, little guy," he whispered. "I'm your dad. I know I messed up pretty bad before you got here, but I promise I'm going to do better. You just need to keep fighting, okay?" Hours passed. Richard shuttled between the NICU and Jennifer's room, providing updates and support. Despite her own recovery, Jennifer insisted on being wheeled to the NICU as soon as she was able. When she saw their son for the first time, Jennifer broke down. "He's so small," she sobbed. Richard wrapped an arm around her shoulders. "But he's strong," he assured her, "just like his mom." As they watched their son fight for his life, Richard and Jennifer found themselves growing closer. The barriers between them slowly began to crumble, replaced by a shared concern for their child. Days turned into weeks, and slowly their son grew stronger. He was taken off the ventilator, then moved out of the incubator. Finally, Jennifer was able to hold him for the first time. As Richard watched Jennifer cradle their son, he felt a profound sense of peace. His empire was gone, his reputation in ruins, but none of that mattered. Everything that truly mattered was right here in this room. "What should we name him?" Jennifer asked, looking up at Richard. Richard thought for a moment. "How about Michael, after my father?" Jennifer smiled. "Michael Miller. I like it." As they sat together, a family at last, Richard knew that this was not an ending, but a beginning. He had a long way to go to make up for his past mistakes, but for the first time in years, he felt truly alive. With Jennifer and Michael by his side, he was ready to face whatever challenges lay ahead. Richard Miller stood before the judge, his lawyer by his side. The courtroom was packed with reporters eager to witness the fall of one of New York's most prominent businessmen. "Mr. Miller, given your cooperation with the investigation and your lack of prior criminal record, the court is inclined to accept the plea deal." The judge announced, "You will serve no jail time, but you'll be required to complete 2,000 hours of community service and pay a substantial fine. Do you accept these terms?" Richard nodded solemnly. "I do, Your Honor." As he left the courthouse, Richard was bombarded by reporters. He ignored their questions, his mind already on his next destination, the hospital where Jennifer and Michael were waiting. At the hospital, Jennifer was sitting by Michael's incubator when Richard arrived. "How did it go?" she asked, her voice tinged with concern. "No jail time," Richard replied, "but I have a lot of community service ahead of me." Jennifer nodded, turning her attention back to Michael. "He's getting stronger every day," she said softly. Richard stepped closer, placing a hand on the incubator. "Hey, little guy, Dad's here." Over the next few weeks, Richard split his time between the hospital and his community service. He was assigned to work with a program that taught entrepreneurship skills to at-risk youth in low-income neighborhoods. At first, Richard felt out of place. These kids saw him as just another rich guy forced to be there. But as he began sharing his knowledge of business and finance, he saw a spark of interest in their eyes. One day, a teenager named Jamal approached him after class. "Mr. Miller," he said, "I got this idea for a business, but I don't know how to start. Can you help me? Richard spent the next hour going over Jamal's business plan, offering suggestions and encouragement. As he left that day, he felt a sense of satisfaction he'd never experienced in his corporate dealings. Back at the hospital, Richard shared his experiences with Jennifer. "These kids have so much potential," he said. "They just need someone to believe in them." Jennifer watched him, a small smile on her face. "You're different," she observed. "This work, it's changing you." Richard nodded. "I think it is for the better. I hope so." As the days passed, Richard and Jennifer fell into a routine. They'd spend mornings with Michael, talking to doctors and watching their son grow stronger. In the afternoons, Richard would go to his community service while Jennifer rested. Slowly, the walls between them began to crumble. Jennifer saw the genuine change in Richard, his growing compassion and humility. But years of hurt and betrayal were not easily forgotten. One evening, as they sat by Michael's crib, he'd finally been moved out of the NICU, Jennifer turned to Richard. "I want to forgive you," she said softly, "but I'm scared." Richard took her hand gently. "I know I hurt you, Jennifer, and I'll spend the rest of my life making it up to you if you'll let me. But I understand if you can't forgive me." Jennifer squeezed his hand. "I'm trying, Richard. Just be patient with me." As Michael grew stronger, Richard and Jennifer's relationship slowly healed. They weren't back together, not officially, but they were co-parenting and rebuilding trust day by day. Then one afternoon, Jennifer received an unexpected call. "Olivia, it's Sarah from El Blanc," the voice said. "I've been thinking, when you're ready to come back to work, how would you feel about running our new pastry program? You've got a real talent." Jennifer was stunned. "Sarah, that's amazing, but I don't know if I can with Michael still in the hospital." "Think about it," Sarah urged. "The offer will be there when you're ready." When Jennifer shared the news with Richard, she saw a flicker of something in his eyes, fear and uncertainty. "That's wonderful, Jennifer," he said, his voice carefully neutral. "You'd be great at it." Jennifer steadied his gaze. "But Richard, no buts. It's a great opportunity. I guess I'm worried about what it means for us, for our family." Jennifer felt a mix of emotions. Part of her was thrilled at the opportunity, a chance to build something for herself. Another part was wary of disrupting the delicate balance they'd achieved. "I haven't decided anything yet," she said. "We're still focused on getting Michael home." Richard nodded, but Jennifer could see the wheels turning in his head. This new opportunity was a test of Richard's growth, of their fragile reconciliation, and of the future they might build together. As they turned back to Michael, who was sleeping peacefully in his crib, Jennifer realized they were at a crossroads. The path ahead was uncertain, but for the first time in a long while, she felt hopeful about the future. 1 year later, the bell above the door of Sweet Beginnings Cafe chimed as the first customer of the day walked in. Jennifer looked up from behind the counter, a warm smile on her face. "Good morning, Mrs. Hall. The usual?" As Jennifer prepared the order, Richard emerged from the back, carrying a tray of freshly baked croissants. The aroma filled the small, cozy space. "Just in time," Jennifer said, taking the tray. "The morning rush will be here soon." Richard nodded, pausing to place a gentle kiss on her cheek before heading to the register. This was the new normal, a far cry from the life they had lived a year ago. The decision to open Sweet Beginnings hadn't been easy. After Michael was finally released from the hospital, healthy and strong, Jennifer had seriously considered Sarah's offer to run the pastry program at El Blanc. But something held her back. "I want to build something of our own," she had told Richard one night. "Something that represents a new start." Richard had been supportive, even though doubts plagued him. He was still completing his community service, and the stigma of his past mistakes followed him. But Jennifer's faith in him never wavered. They pooled their resources, what little Richard had left after the legal settlements, and Jennifer's savings from her time at El Blanc. It was barely enough to secure a small storefront and basic equipment. The first few months were tough. Long hours, tight budgets, and the constant fear of failure tested their resolve. But slowly, word spread about Jennifer's delectable pastries and the warm atmosphere of the cafe. As the morning rush began, Richard and Jennifer moved in sync, a well-oiled team. They had learned to work together, balancing each other's strengths and weaknesses. During a lull, Richard's mind drifted to a conversation they had during those early uncertain days. "What if we fail?" he had asked, the weight of his past failures heavy on his shoulders. Jennifer had taken his hand. "Then we fail together, and we try again. That's what partners do." Her words had given him strength, reminding him of the man he was striving to become. As noon approached, a group of women entered the cafe. Jennifer's face lit up. It was time for her baking class. What had started as a one-off event had turned into a regular program. Jennifer taught baking skills to single mothers, many of whom were struggling to find employment. Some had even gone on to find jobs in bakeries and restaurants. "Today, we're tackling sourdough," Jennifer announced, leading them to the kitchen. Richard watched her go, marveling at her strength and compassion. She had taken her own painful experiences and turned them into a way to help others. Her resilience never ceased to amaze him. As noon approached, a group of women entered the cafe. Jennifer's face lit up. It was time for her baking class. What had started as a one-off event had turned into a regular program. Jennifer taught baking skills to single mothers, many of whom were struggling to find employment. Some had even gone on to find jobs in bakeries and restaurants. "Today, we're tackling sourdough," Jennifer announced, leading them to the kitchen. Richard watched her go, marveling at her strength and compassion. She had taken her own painful experiences and turned them into a way to help others. Her resilience never ceased to amaze him. As the afternoon wore on, Richard prepared for his own meeting. A group of young entrepreneurs from his old community service program was coming for advice on their business plans. He thought back to Jamal, the first young man he'd mentored. Jamal's small tech repair business was now thriving, employing several of his peers. Successes like these gave Richard a sense of purpose he had never found in his corporate conquests. As Richard worked with the young entrepreneurs, he caught sight of Jennifer through the kitchen window. She was laughing with her students, flour smudged on her cheek. His heart swelled with love and gratitude. Later, as they closed up shop, Michael toddled in from the small back room where he spent his days under the watchful eye of a kindly retired neighbor. "Mama, Dada," he called, his arms outstretched. Jennifer scooped him up, peppering his face with kisses. Richard joined them, enveloping his family in a warm embrace. As they stood there, surrounded by the fruits of their labor, Richard reflected on their journey. They had faced countless challenges, legal battles, financial struggles, and the lingering shadows of past mistakes. But through it all, they had grown stronger, both as individuals and as a couple. They weren't perfect. They still had arguments and faced moments of doubt, but they had learned to tackle these challenges together, with honesty and compassion. Jennifer set Michael down, watching as he toddled over to a low table, reaching for a toy. "He's getting so big," Richard mused. Jennifer leaned into Richard's side. "We're doing okay, aren't we?" she asked softly. Richard looked around the cafe at the life they had built together. It wasn't the empire he once dreamed of, but it was something far more valuable. "We're doing great," he replied, pressing a kiss to her temple. As they watched their son play, bathed in the warm glow of the setting sun streaming through the cafe windows, Richard and Jennifer knew that this simple, honest life, filled with love and purpose, was the true meaning of success. Sweet Beginnings wasn't just the name of their cafe. It was the story of their lives, a testament to the power of redemption, forgiveness, and the strength of love that can weather any storm. What do you think of the story? Did Jennifer make the right decision going back to Richard? Share your opinion.